Hey everybody, this is Nephi Cole from the Your Mountain Podcast. We're excited to share some upcoming information about a few new sponsors, but you'll have to wait for that. First, we want to say thank you to Vortex Optics, Gunworks, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, Federal Premium Ammunition, and Viking Tactics, who have been longtime supporters and strategic partners. We also need to say this. The opinions you hear on Your Mountain from individual hosts or guests do not necessarily represent those of Your Mountain, our sponsors, or other entities we're affiliated with professionally or otherwise. You've waited long enough. Go listen to the show.
There are millions of acres of opportunity out there. They belong to you. Every day, decisions are being made that affect your land, your water, your wildlife. You should know about them. This is Your Mountain.
Hey everybody, welcome back for another episode of the COVID-19 Your Mountain Podcast. Brought to you by COVID-19. Brought to you by COVID-19. I don't know. No. But anyway, welcome back to the Your Mountain Podcast. As we remain hunkered down in our homes through this COVID outbreak. Mike and Nephi are both here.
What's up, Dave?
We're actually both there, I guess. I'm looking at you though.
I see you on the screen. I'm good. I'm good.
I like your shirt, Dave. Surf Wyoming.
Surf Wyoming.
Yeah.
Bison riding a wave, man.
Did you get that for free?
Actually, my wife bought it for me for a
that counts as yes.
No, it means that either she or I or both of us paid for it. So,
well, that also counts as yes, I guess.
So it's not free because it came out of my bank account. The hat I'm wearing is free.
Yeah,
looks good. Cryptech Highlander.
That's right. Cryptech pattern, right?
Invisible.
Buddy of mine owns this company, TO Engineers. They're not sponsoring us. I'm just throwing them out there.
Buddy of mine owns Cryptech.
There you go. So mesh them together and you have the ultimate hat. Anyway, so here we are. Week 9,000 of, we're still in 2020, right?
I don't even know I don't know.
Is there a 2020? That's what I want to know. Is there?
It's like the leap year.
It's the perpetual Sunday. You always you just can't quite get relaxed enough. The next day is always going to be a work day. And so you can't really go anywhere. You can't do anything. It's just always this like Sunday.
And Nephi's onto something. It is leap year. That extra day has made this year seem about 6 years longer.
Yeah, it's been ridiculous.
It couldn't be anything else. It's that extra day in February. It just threw off all of the biorhythms, everything, and it just kind of messed with this.
If this would have happened during whatever the Mayan calendar year was, people would have lost their mind.
Was that 2012?
And somewhere in there, I don't remember. Yeah,
suggesting that was the end of times, right?
Yeah, I think they just stopped counting.
You know what I'm thankful
Maybe
for?
This is probably actual 2012. They didn't count for leap years. All those days added up over time, and it turns out this is actually the Mayan calendar 2012.
As much as I enjoyed it, aren't you guys glad we don't work for the governor's office anymore?
Oh my word!
Can you
imagine? Oh my gosh, what they're going through?
Yeah.
Oh, they just finished a special session.
Oh yeah, I was
for the first time in a decade.
Yeah, all 2 days of it.
Right.
Craziness.
Somehow figured out how to spend $1.2 billion in 2 days. Wish I had that problem.
Yeah, well, you don't.
It reminds me of Brewster's Million. Did you ever see that movie as a kid?
I own the I'm going to date myself. I own the VHS.
I bet you do.
Yeah. Because I still have a VCR. In fact,
you would lose the bet because you would have no way to spend $1 million. You physically couldn't do it, David.
I on what? I have everything I need. I've got a VCR and a cathode.
Your arms are
TV.
too short. You couldn't pull your wallet out. It just would.
That was a great movie though.
Oh my goodness. Well, you know what's interesting? It's interesting. I was talking to you pre-show, Dave, about this, but it's interesting. We're in the time, COVID-19, where we're talking about some challenging political issues on a scale that everybody is aware of and familiar with, which is this, we've got this disease out there, and it's actually, fairly rare still, but there's all these precautions to deal with disease. There's experts on one side, experts on another, a bunch of people fighting over it, and it affects all of us. Isn't it exciting that we get to transition that level of animosity that we all see, that we can now understand the argument of the issue we're about to talk about?
Well, that's one of the reasons why I decided to take on this issue today, right? So, exactly to your point, we're all dealing with a pandemic that has been not conclusively shown yet, but we're getting closer and closer to being shown to have transmitted from wildlife to humans in some way, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so
cats can get it. I was wondering about that.
Other wildlife or non-wildlife can get it too. I don't consider cats wildlife in the context you're talking about them. But we have this pandemic that passes from wildlife to people and has passed around the globe. And now we're talking about different states are reopening or phasing in reopenings and trying to bring the economy back to life while still balancing against these issues of the disease.
Would have been nice if we could have just kept it in the bats, wouldn't it?
Is that a harbinger here? Are you doing a harbinger?
Well, I'm just saying, it would have been nice.
Okay. Well, we'll let you rest on that thought for a minute.
Okay.
So but that whole idea is what made us take on this topic today, which is actually a topic that was submitted to us by one of our listeners several months ago, in fact, which is to say, and before I go any deeper here, which is to say, if you're sending us ideas, we are listening. Sometimes it might take us a while to get to them, assuming we do get to them. We get to a lot of them. So don't be discouraged if you send in an idea and a couple months go by and you don't hear it. It's just, sometimes it takes a while. And this one, so the idea came in, and this one, not only did it take us a while, but then as we're preparing for it, our heads are starting to spin. This is a really hard issue. And the deeper you get into it, the harder it gets.
The deeper you get into it, the less you want to talk about it. Because it's like, it's like there's one of my favorite analogies, the knowledge sphere.
Hey, before you do that, I know you want to do it. I need to make one more plug for our podcast before we just go all in, if you don't mind.
Did you interrupt me?
I did. Is that
proud
cool?
of you. Go ahead.
Thanks. All right. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to put in a plug. I was finishing this thought so technically you interrupted me first. So I was finishing this, thought, around, taking ideas from listeners. And what I wanted to do is get back to that and say, continue to send us ideas, right? Continue to reach out to us through our email account, through, at yourmountain at itsyourmountain.com. Find us on social media at the handles, at It's Your Mountain, which is on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. Get a hold of us any way you can. Leave us comments. Even, when you're reviewing us on iTunes, obviously we want that 5-star review. But in your comment there, when you're doing the review, if you have an idea, some people leave show ideas there. Leave an idea there. It really helps us know what you want to hear us discuss. And so I just wanted to put that out there. Reach out to us, leave those ratings, give us some feedback, and then we'll do our best not to butcher your suggestion here. So with that, we're going to try really hard. With that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Nephi.
Sphere of knowledge.
Your sphere of knowledge.
Yeah. For all of us in our lives, this is an important note. This is a production note for us, something, that I think needs to be said about how we deal with issues and we talk about them. We don't know everything. And we have divergent opinions. And sometimes on the air, before we get on the air, we're going to argue through something and talk about who's going to talk about which side of it. But know this, all of us, there's only so much that we know. And it's like a sphere. And what we know is inside that sphere. There's a whole bunch of stuff that we don't know. And that's the surface of the sphere. It's the outer circumference. The more you know and you put inside your circle of understanding, the more you know that you don't know. And so the reason I say that is because this is one of those issues where if you approach this issue initially, just gut reaction, what you hear and what you think to be right in your head, but first of all, there's not really a right and wrong, but you're going to be able to argue it from one side. But the more you learn about it, the more you realize it's a complex issue, like many issues in natural resource management. And the more you learn about them, the more you realize there's even more to learn. There's more to understand. And it's okay to not agree with somebody on this. It's okay to sit down and to argue with one of your best friends about, the pros and cons and the different sides of an argument, because in doing that, you become more informed, and you're going to be a better person through having that conversation that may not always agree. And honestly, you're going to know more than you would if you had a conversation with somebody who was just a yes man and agreed with you all the time and said everything that you want. So don't be afraid of issues like this, and don't be afraid to entertain alternative points of view and to have a robust discussion to figure out, that there may be other truth out there that you weren't aware of, and that there may be areas where you were dead right. And having these discussions is going to help you be stronger in your arguments and just be a smarter person. It's going to increase your sphere of knowledge. So with that, now I'll back away.
All right. And not to just heap praise on you here, Nephi, but I agree with you. We'll disagree later. I guarantee you we're going to disagree. We'll probably agree on a lot, but we're going to disagree some in the podcast. But I agree with you on this for sure.
I don't know if Mike agrees or not because he's just quiet.
Yeah, we're going to force Mike to really dive in this one.
You know who wants you to talk more? Eric Dinger does.
Eric Dinger does? Why?
I don't know. I have no idea.
Okay. All right.
But I'm just saying.
Okay.
Everybody wants you to talk
Eric
more.
Make Eric happy.
You bring levity to us here.
I do.
Plus you got
levity. I don't think is the right word.
I think it's a pretty apt word to describe what it is that you bring to our discussion.
No.
Okay. So you're going to contribute a bunch.
I am. Absolutely.
Today we're going to talk about llamas and goats and sheep and the backcountry. And I'm going to leave you hanging for one more second because I did want to mention there's some current events going on out there. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of things going on out there in the natural resource space, since we're not going to get to talk to you again for, just so everybody knows, we've backed off until things get back to normal to releasing these episodes about every other week, until the country gets back, to a more, regular schedule and people are going into work and traveling and all that sort of thing. So we're going to be about every other week. We don't want some of this information to become irrelevant. So we need to mention a couple things. One, grizzly bears. So if you remember thinking back to some earlier discussions we've had, we've talked a fair amount actually over a series of podcasts about grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone area and the delisting process that went on there. And we mentioned how they'd been delisted in 2017, and then immediately federal judge in Montana put an injunction on that delisting, and pending resolution of litigation. And that lawsuit went through the Montana District Court, and the delisting rule was vacated and the listing rule was put back in place. That was appealed to the Ninth Circuit, and last week the United States, I hope you're not in the bathroom, Mike. Just pouring water. That last week, arguments were held before the Ninth Circuit on that case.
Did Jay Jurdy argue? Because I thought I read something about his name in the paper.
Jay Jurdy did argue that on behalf. So he was the attorney on behalf of the state of Wyoming.
That's right.
Actually, Jay's the guy that hired me at the Attorney General's office. Yeah.
His fault.
So my whole career is his fault. Yeah. He hired me back in 2005 to do natural resource law at the Attorney General's office. Anyway, he was arguing that case, and then the United States was arguing as well, and obviously the plaintiffs were arguing the case as well. So that decision, or that case, has been argued. Decision is pending. But one thing that's worth noting is at least one argument. This is going to be an interesting legal thing. In fact, I'd turn it to Mike here on this question. I haven't really thought this through, and I know I'm going to catch him off guard.
Neither is Mike, based on
I saw his facial expression. So when this lawsuit happened, the United States, in defending the delisting rule, they defended several of the issues, but one issue they decided they weren't going to defend, which was this question about whether there modeling for population estimates in the future was appropriate. How that would be done and whether that was appropriate. I'm not going to go into detail on it, but this is the interesting legal question. They gave that up, or they didn't necessarily give it. They chose not to argue it.
Yeah.
The state of Wyoming, as a defendant intervener, did argue that in defense of that delisting rule. And the question I have for you, Mike, this is a purely legal question. You know where I'm going, right?
Are we allowed to?
You got it.
You could ask Jay that. He would know. He looked at it. So the basis is that, so we had Chow, and then we had Chow 2 method, and the United States was uneasy with the idea that if we set a population number for grizzly bears and a different mechanism for counting came along, that suddenly we would just try to go in and sell licenses to wipe out the rest. Or whatever the differences of the two different models. And so I think there was some distrust of the federal government that the state would manage appropriately. So they chose not to challenge that. They figured they can adjust that by rule. But the state did. And normally, an intervener doesn't have standing to appeal something, an intervener in like a government setting. So a private group or even a state that comes in and intervenes on the side of the federal government chooses not to appeal something. Well, some special interest group can't just go in and say, well, I'm going to take the issue up when the federal government has already gone back in and decided it's going to change its ways in light of a court opinion. So it's not really a tested waters of whether an intervener could raise an issue not addressed by the federal government. I've seen plenty of appeals in which the court limits what an intervener can say. And so theoretically, if the position of a court is that you intervener are only allowed to address what the feds don't or choose not to, then it might be allowed. But such a singular issue that was affirmatively ruled on by a court, I don't know. I think the Ninth Circuit will take it up. They'll probably only really address whatever the United States decided to talk about, and maybe there'll be a footnote and say there's some other stuff that other people talk about, but we're not going to get there. I don't know. I'd be surprised if they took it on straight on, but it'll be a question that maybe we'll get some resolution out of the Ninth Circuit on whether that's permissible or not, and then that'll get overturned later by the Supreme Court, because statistically that's how that works.
Well, that's how it used to work. Is that still how it works? There's been a lot of turnover in the Ninth Circuit. There
have that court has shifted. I don't know.
Yeah, you realize now that you're not the deputy attorney general, how much stuff we're gonna when Wyoming, how much stuff that's in the closet, how many skeletons we're gonna get to pull out now and actually kind of tell everybody really what happened. It's gonna be awesome.
But you do know that. So I was part of those conversations internally on that question, and
you can't
I don't
get fired
remember
by Jay anymore, though.
Yeah, but I don't remember what we talked about. I don't remember the answer we came to. Obviously, we did it anyways, right? The state decided to take it on and submit something on it, and then we'll have to be told you can't.
Yeah, and I'd follow up. My readout of the argument. Now, anything can happen, but my readout of how the panel of judges responded to that argument, Wyoming's position, was not that favorable to Wyoming. Is just as a heads up. So that might make prevailing on all issues in that rule difficult. And in absence of prevailing on all issues for the state and the federal government, the delisting rule will not go back into effect. There will have to be new rulemaking consistent with the decision of the court.
Yeah, which is why this just is one little piece that drives me nuts about the Endangered Species Act, because that the whole reason you have a recovered species continue to be listed is because there's distrust that a state can manage the species they're in charge of managing.
You know what's amazing about that? Because I get frustrated too. I've been doing some research recently on the endangered species. I actually am working on a law review article right now on a sub issue of it.
PSA?
No, right? Yeah, no, it's not my thing, right? So one, I've talked about this a few times on this podcast, and it remains true.
At least 3.
no species that's ever been delisted due to recovery has ever been relisted. Mm-hmm. So I really struggle with this argument that states can't be trusted to manage wildlife.
When they've always succeeded.
Well, when they've always succeeded.
Yeah, but like grizzly bears, everybody agrees. Okay, they're recovered. Right. Great. And the federal government's like, fine, we'll work through a process to delist them. And like the biggest sticking point was the stupid model.
Which they were the ones that wanted to change, not the states.
But then, no, wait a minute. Maybe the state will come in and suddenly the number will change. We'll still have a recovered species, but we don't want you adjusting what you allow for take.
But that was the biggest sticking point this time. There'll be a different sticking point next time. And the point is, for some species, it doesn't matter what the states will do and what the likelihood of recovery for the foreseeable future is. They're we use this phrase a lot. They're the charismatic megafauna, right? They're that transcendent species that they for whatever reason, and that typically the reason is they don't want to see any take of that species, any regulated hunting of that species of any kind. And so groups that are challenging it, it's going to be a new issue each time. What's interesting about the Endangered Species Act, and then we'll move on. What's interesting is I've had this perception in my head because of the state I come from and the issues I've dealt with, that basically anytime a species is proposed for delisting, there's litigation, because that's just the way it's felt here. In Wyoming, you've had delisting litigation with grizzly bears, with wolves. You've had Preble's Meadow jumping mouse. You've had bald eagle. Right? That's almost half of all delisting litigation ever in the country. There have only been something like 8 cases involving delisted species or proposed delisted species in the history of the act, which I find fascinating. It's roughly 13% of all delisted species due to recovery have been challenged.
The flying squirrel.
Yeah. And so that's the part that baffles me. It actually isn't all that many, but when you look at the ones that are challenged, typically they're things like bald eagle, grizzly bear, wolves. It's those very charismatic species.
The flying squirrel.
You know what Al Simpson used to say?
That one was challenged too.
Yeah.
Actually. Yeah.
Al Simpson used to say, most people, when the horse dies, they just get off.
Are you suggesting
I'd like to know, how come I can't ride a llama?
But I got one more. I've got one more. This one's short, but we've talked about it recently.
Yeah.
And it's, we bring it up every time it happens, the reappointment of William Perry Pendley to acting BLM,
which now happens
director,
all the time.
Which now is on an every 30-day basis instead of every few months. Mm-hmm. Last week, a handful of groups, I don't know which groups they were, not worth it anyway, challenged the Secretary Bernhardt's reappointment of acting directors, suggesting that they've violated the law in continuing these appointments past a certain period of time. That's all I'm going to say on that. The suggestion is the law caps a time that an acting director can be in place for up to 210 days. And currently, for example, acting director Pendley has been there for almost 300 days. And the Park Service, the acting director Vila, who used to be the superintendent of Grand Teton National Park, has been there for about 230 days. And so that is being challenged. And so that gets
by the way.
That gets at the appointment, how the appointment process should or should not work at Interior or at any agency. So that's just a heads up that lawsuit's out there. Don't know how that's going to go, where it's going to go, timelines or anything. Just wanted to make people aware that that's going on.
Okay.
Now,
so tell me about
Nephi's chomping at the bit.
Yeah. Tell me about the bronchial associated lymphoid tissue hyperplasia.
Wow, that was a lot. I don't even know what you're talking about. I just want to know, how come I can't ride llamas?
Oh, okay. That's a little simple. Okay. So
how can't Dave, let's better set the table for this issue.
All right, let me set the table really quickly. We're going to Alaska right now. Man, I wish we really were going to Alaska. We're virtually going to Alaska, mentally moving to the Chugach National Forest, right? Which is along, it's just south and east of Anchorage, follows that coastline. It's about 6 million acres, a little more than that, large national forest. The dispute we're talking about today involves a forest plan, not revision, but a new forest plan revision, new forest plan. So here's what happened just from a procedural standpoint, so you know kind of where we are. Back in 2012, and this is a process that goes on with every national forest unit in the United States. It's not unique to Alaska, this planning process. So it's important, I think, for people to know this is going on. We're going to talk about a very specific issue, but it's important for people to know about this process and how to engage in these processes that are going on in your backyard or places you want to hunt, because decisions are made in these planning processes that can affect a landscape for several decades. So here's what goes on. Back in 2012, the Forest Service begins a process engaging the public to do a plan revision to a 2002 land management plan.
And did they use the 1986 rule or the 2012 rule?
Well, now now you've lost me.
Okay.
I wasn't going to go that deep into
right.
the weeds.
All right.
You're welcome to find that out and dive that deep if you want. I'm giving this is my 15,000 to 30 foot view. Right?
Okay. Anyways, go ahead.
Anyway, so they start a process in 2012. And I'm going to tell you right now, the process finalized in 2020. And you're going to ask yourself, does it really take 8 years to go through a land management plan revision process? And I'm going to tell you, and then I'm interested in these guys' feedback, I'm going to tell you that's a pretty aggressive timeline in some cases.
Well done.
Yeah, right.
Pat on the back.
Yeah. We haven't gotten the litigation part. That's just to get from beginning to rod, right? The record of decision.
Yeah, exactly. From initiating the process to record of decision, about 8 years. And you're thinking, holy smokes, 8 years is a long time. And we're sitting here thinking, man, that was an efficient use of time. They really knocked that out in a hurry. But here's how these land management plans are supposed to work. You spend a lot of time revising them and have them put in place, and then they're guiding your management decisions on that national forest for the next 15 to 20 years, sometimes longer, because as Mike hinted, you can wind up in litigation over these revisions. And so you could be operating for much longer than 20 years.
So the forestry's land management plans are supposed to only last like 10 years, but when it takes 10 years to build one, and they'll do amendments throughout that time to try to adjust minor issues before they go do a complete revision. But you can figure that it's going to be like a resource management plan on BLM land, right? They're there for a long time. They're big picture, but we always fight over them.
Yeah, and so here's how this process works. So they started this 8 years ago, and this invokes the National Environmental Policy Act. And there's a very specific process that you have to go through in this. And you're going to ask, well, why are you diving in? I'm not going to go into the weeds of the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA as it's referred to typically, but I am going to talk about a couple of important pieces of it, which is they're important because it's how we got to a decision we're going to be talking about today. So NEPA was put in place to force federal agencies to take a hard look at human impacts on the environment, both positive and negative, in any decision that they make on the human environment, right?
That's not, adverse impacts to the human environment is what's in the statute, but right. you just said human impacts on the environment.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to say, you're right.
No, I know, but people
that
get
is
that
kind
backwards.
Yeah. Well, I corrected myself mid-sentence.
And Mike used to sue the federal government all the time. There we go. Go ahead.
Well, not on those, but
well, and actually, Mike, if you want to take the process point, and run through it, happy to turn that over to you. I was just going to run. I was just going to run through real quick.
No, you're right. Keep going.
Okay,
you got it.
All right. So it triggers a review. In most cases, you have to decide. Let's just skip the different prongs because that just gets confusing. We're just going to say in this particular process, you identify an action. In this instance, it's going to be this forest plan. You have to look at it and say, are there environmental effects likely going to be significant? If the answer is yes, which in a forest plan, it's almost always going to be yes, you go to, okay, you run down a flow chart that they put together, and it's, okay, are you going to have significant environmental effects that may or will occur? If so, then you have to issue a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement. Then you have to go through public scoping, which means having public involvement. You draft an environmental impact statement. You have public review and comment on the draft environmental impact statement. You have a final environmental impact statement. You make that available, and you can make that available for protesting. And then you have a record of decision, which is the final agency action that says, okay, we've done this entire review, and here's the record of decision on this plan. And then you implement the plan. And of course, there are other pieces we haven't talked about there, like the litigation that can come out and the various points of comment. But that's the general timeline of how this goes. So why am I mentioning that? And it's because in this Forest Service process, they started in 2012, and what they did is they started with a series of meetings. So they had 18 public workshops, 2 public comment periods, 9 public open houses, followed by an objection period and other associated outreach. I want to talk specifically about the objection period for the Chugach National Forest. So in the draft environmental, or not in the draft, in the draft environmental impact statement, it lays out the plan for here's the plan for the forest going forward the next 20 years. Right? In this instance, in the draft, it didn't talk anything about pack llamas. Now this environmental impact statement is hundreds of pages long. And we're talking about one small issue of a much larger document today.
Yep.
And I want to make that clear. We're talking about one small issue of a much, much larger document that encompasses myriad other issues. But for this purposes, we're talking about the pack llamas. The draft environmental impact statement didn't say anything about them.
And that's very important.
That's very important.
This piece of process right here it was not in there. And that's going to be important coming up for what occurred here in the Chugach.
Right. So when the final environmental impact statement was released, and that was released last August, if I have my timeline right here, it included a ban of pack goats and llamas in the Chugach National Forest. And
were goats weren't mentioned on the initial either?
And I may be, I don't know if I might be out of line here. For sure, that's llamas. Okay. I don't know about goats. Let's talk about llamas. Let's talk about llamas because that's what we for sure know.
And just go ahead.
Okay. So the final environmental impact statement bans llamas on the basis, and the justification for this is on the basis of a fear of disease threats to native wild sheep populations in the national forest. There's a fear of disease transmission. This is the justification at the time. There's a fear of disease transmission from these pack llamas to wild sheep, the thin-horned sheep.
That's why I was getting into the 1986 versus the 2012 rule, because the 1986 rule had a species viability component that really favored, or at least the courts started to interpret that rule to say you really have to preserve all the native species. And if you introduce something else, you can't allow for certain things to come in and have an impact on native species, even though they're a state managed species. And everybody knows the federal government's responsible for maintaining habitat, not animals. And so the 2012 rule was a series of about 14 years trying to unwind and about 6 different versions to unwind that specific thing. And I did look it up, and they went with the 2012 rule, which is just different under that component. Yet you still have that same justification on preserving a native species by excluding a domesticated type animal.
for a little piece of process so that everybody understands. And one of the issues that you have here, again, so in the draft version, the idea here is if you're going to have finalized something, you have to give people an opportunity to comment on that. When they never talked about llamas or goats in the first version, nobody, for example, Nephi Cole, who wants to go I wanted to ride a llama around the Chugach really bad. Well, they didn't ever mention anything about me riding llamas in the Chugach on my tiny saddle. And so now in the final version, it's in there. And so, but I didn't get to ask that question. I didn't get to ask, I didn't even get to try and ride a llama.
Yeah, that can create all kinds of problems. And I mean, they don't have to write everything identical from draft to final. Usually the benchmark that you use is, well, is it a logical outgrowth from one draft to the final? Like, could you have anticipated that to come along?
Yeah. Could an average person have anticipated that would be the outcome from draft to final?
Right.
Yeah. And so there's a protest process here. So you open up the final EIS. You've already had comments, remember. You've already done comments on the draft environmental impact statement. So you have the final environmental impact statement. Before you have the record of decision, the Forest Service offers a 60-day objection period or protest period. During that period of time, that's when you can, there are a couple of ways to protest, and one of them is that you've protested, like you've commented at other points of the process, and you're still not satisfied with the result on your issue, and you're gonna issue an objection. Another one is what we just got at here, which is something new was added that could not have been anticipated, and you're going to protest that was a violation of NEPA process, that you weren't given the opportunity, afforded the opportunity to have notice and comment, or public comment and review, right? So those are really the two processes. And in this instance, there were 46 eligible objections. During that objection period, there were literally thousands of objections filed, and of the thousands, there were 46 that met the criteria to be valid objections, meaning they met one of the two things we just mentioned, and they met the other criteria that you have to do from a procedural standpoint to be
considered valid.
Valid.
Yeah, maybe because the door goes both ways, right? They can't bring up something last second and change it on you without telling you, and you can't go to court and challenge their decision unless you raised an issue beforehand. So they had an opportunity to make adjustments. Yep. It's sort of a, goose gander sort of situation.
Yeah, exactly. So that happened. And one of the things that was protested at the time was about this inclusion of this ban of llamas, pack llamas, and the justification for that being disease transmission, saying we couldn't have possibly anticipated that this was going to be the outcome, that you were going to do this.
Because you never mentioned it.
Because you never mentioned it before. We never saw anything about it until the final EIS came out, right? And so we were blindsided by it. Yeah. And so that's what happened there. Okay. And so then a decision is made based on that protest. You'll have the protest come in, and the Forest Service will respond to those and then issue its record of decision. And in that response time, or in that, in responding to the objection, I keep mixing up objection and protest, just view them as the same thing, but the objection, I think it was the regional forester replied to that comment and said, yeah, you're right. You couldn't really reasonably anticipate that outcome from the draft EIS to the final EIS. And so it removed any reference to a ban on pack llamas and any reference to the comments about the concern about disease transmission between llamas and wild sheep.
Which is an interesting subject, because we're talking about bovidae versus I mean, maybe you're going to get into this, but camels versus bovidae. You're talking about some there's some legitimate questions and some significant arguments here that go on about whether, are llamas potentially an issue for wild sheep? And this is where it gets really geeky. So we got in and read a whole
oh my
bunch.
Gosh, so much. And are you willing to step back just a little before we dive into that and say the reason why this has become an issue, and not just with llamas, but with goats and domestic sheep? It's because, at least with wild sheep populations, and in particular bighorn sheep populations in the lower 48 states,
this is great because it's so deep. There's so many little go
right
ahead,
there's just layer upon layer.
Yes.
That, this is the thickest onion I've ever dug up out of the ground.
We're talking about bighorn sheep now.
We're talking about bighorn sheep, but with respect to bighorn sheep, we have a 120 or 130 year plus history of studying the responses from bighorn sheep to certain domesticated animals. And we've also got a lot of information that suggests that bighorn sheep are very susceptible to certain kinds of pathogens, and they can, like pneumonia, pathogens that can cause pneumonia, and that they can have extreme die-offs. Large percentages of the populations can die off from these diseases that they get. And so there is a legitimate, when you're looking at bighorn sheep in the lower 48 states, for example, there is a legitimate connection in some places between domestic livestock and bighorn sheep and transmitting diseases. And so for decades, there have been management approaches taken by state wildlife management agencies and the land management agencies to try and make sure that you minimize the commingling of those animals to reduce the
spread of disease,
or the opportunity for the spread of disease.
Yeah, and that's where it gets really wonky, because when you start talking about this, you have to realize that so first of all, the death of bighorn sheep caused by this pneumonia is rarely caused by a single bacterium. It's often caused by multiple different vectors at the same time that cause it. And so, and not everything can carry all these vectors. And so,
and there can be other environmental stressors too.
There typically are other environmental stressors. There's typically, multiple bacterial infections that are involved, and certain animals carry some of them and certain animals don't. And so, for example, if you were to look at, again, camelids versus bovidae, so you're talking about with llamas, right? You're talking about a different species. It's not in the same family.
Different family,
right? And so, so you're talking about kingdom, phylum, order, class, family, genus, species. You're talking about a whole different branch there. Having said that, you can see bacterial infections in the same things, just like we can see similar bacterial infections that we might have. A similar type of bacteria, a horse might, have or a cow might have a similar sickness. But it's just like, this gets really complex because the science on this, even though they're trying really hard and they've got a lot of it, it's complex, and everybody doesn't know everything. When you take these things, so if you take some of the studies that I read going in, or if you take animal A and animal B, even if they may be of different families, and you infect them with with some pathogen, and you put them in a pen together, and you keep them in proximity for 100 days, guess what? The pathogen, when they're both drinking out of the same water, can transfer over. Now, that's going to bring up a lot of questions about how often do these animals actually interact. Is Group A always sick, or the fact that we gave Group A a virus or a bacteria to try and give it to Group B, is that legitimate? These are questions that are playing out in real time in this argument, and it's not done.
I'm smart enough to know that when I pull the string, it tells me that the cow says moo. But I do know that anytime you have such a dramatic die-off of a species and you have some sort of mild correlation, we're going to do everything we can to keep that kind of die-off. When you lose 95% of a herd and it carries forward to the young that do happen to make it. That's a problem, and we overreact when we manage.
Yeah. And go ahead, Dave.
Oh, yeah. And I was going to say in the context of bighorn sheep, and then we'll move back north. We'll start working our way back north. But in the context of bighorn sheep, around 1900, nobody really knows exactly how many bighorn sheep there were, but we know there's a whole lot more than there are today. And we have a sense that we probably in some of these herds have seen, to Mike's point, 90 to 95% die off over the past 120 years. Now, we've seen some bounce back in the past 40 years, probably because of some management prescriptions. But we've seen a pretty big die off, and that gets to that.
Guesstimates were, Dave, that it was around 2 million, and that's probably on the high side. It's being generous. And today, and then down to 15,000, now back up to around 84,000.
Yeah, and I do that. I say I struggle with these. This is my.
Yeah, I know. It's all conjecture.
I always struggle with these. Here was the estimate 120 years ago of something. Well, I'll give you my example. And then this is my little tangent, and then we'll get back on track. I get frustrated with like the grizzly bear estimate, for example. I've seen estimates that grizzly bears used to number in the range of 50,000 across the country. Right? I think, okay,
who counted that?
I want to know who and how counted that, because we have the most studied population of grizzly bears on the planet in the Yellowstone area, and using the most conservative population modeling we have, or the best population modeling we have, with the highest confidence interval of 95% confidence that we have, we can safely assume there's somewhere between 700 and 1,200 grizzly bears up in that one part of the state, based on the best available science that we have in 2020. And so, if that's the case, how do we know what these numbers were?
Was it somebody's diary where they did a journal entry and said that,
I saw a bajillion.
For example, the sage grouse blacked out the sky,
and then they times square miles, and you get your number.
Yeah,
sure it did.
Yeah, it's the same thing with bison. At one point have been estimated to be 60 million, and then 30 million, and then maybe it's more like 15 to 20 million. And let's just say there were a lot more animals then than there are today. And I think that's probably a safe assumption
by orders of magnitude.
But I have a difficult time honing in on I know people like to have those actuals to visualize, but I have a difficult time honing in on them. Yeah. But there were a lot more. There are a lot less today. There's my tangent.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, guys.
No, it's good.
Well, and even in modern times, we can see a significant die-off quickly, over a very short period of time. It's not necessarily that it has to take 120 years to see that kind of reduction. It
can happen very quickly.
We see the pneumonia spread through a herd and wipe it out.
Now, I do think it's important to point out, and this is that in some of the studies that have been seen regarding bighorns and and pathogens that cause pneumonia and can cause death, is that in the numbers that you look at in a lot of the studies, you had domestic sheep and bighorn sheep. You've seen those 95% die-offs, like you said, Mike. There have been other studies that have compared, for example, goats. Well, the numbers weren't that high, and so you saw a die off in the bighorn sheep. Again, these are in controlled laboratory environments. I say laboratory, I mean small enclosures. You saw 20% die off in that case versus the 95.
Are you talking, when you say goats, are you saying mountain goats, wild mountain goats?
No, I'm talking.
You're talking domestic goats. Okay, I just want to make that clear. Clear.
So I'm talking about domestic goats, and so and that's why. One of the arguments that you had in places where people said, let's ban, for example, pack goats. Well, the folks from the Pack Goat Association would say, wait a minute, the science that's out there, and there's some science out, but USDA produced stuff says that pack goats aren't that virulent and when it comes to bighorn sheep. And then they're going to say, well, our pack goats aren't ever around the sheep. And the other thing they're going to say is that and again, I'm talking about pack goats here, you're going to say that, we tested all, there was a study from USDA tested about 600 goats, and they said, well, only 4% of them or 5% of them had the bacteria that we're talking about that could be potentially is the problematic bacteria. And those were only, 90% of those 6% of animals. So you're really whittling it down to like 0.5%. Most of those animals were under 1 year old, the ones that had them. And so that's going to be part of the argument that now is going to come back up, where, the sheep guy is going to say, well, this guy's going to say, I'm not part of the problem. And the llama guy is going to say, I'm not part of the problem. And the goat guy is going to say, I'm not part of the problem, because there's all these different levels of risk inherent to potentially hurting Rocky Mountain, hurting bighorn sheep. And that's where I say this, there's a lot of layers to the onion, and it gets very complex.
Yeah, it does. And we don't want to unpack. I was going to use a bad dad joke or pun or whatever. We don't want to unpack all of that. Right? Yeah. We're not going to unpack all of this.
No.
But we're going to we're going to stay high level.
Yeah.
So that we don't make major mistakes on this. But we want to.
We're going to say it's hard.
It's really hard.
Issue, and this is one of those issues where, we don't know it all, and nobody probably does at this point.
So let's do this. So we've talked about bighorn sheep, but the issue that brought us to this is really we're up in Alaska, and we're talking about doll sheep and stone sheep. We're talking about the thin horn sheep, right? And what are the potential effects there? I want to talk about that, because that's what was interesting about this process in the forest plan. Right, is that there was this justification for banning pack llamas in the national forest due to this fear of disease transmission. And let's just run through quickly. Let's just run through what some of the information they might have been relying on was saying. I don't want to dive into the validity of it either way.
So we're shifting from the Chugach now. We're going to shift to a new forest. Or not yet?
No, I wanted to go to the back.
Okay.
Yeah, back up to the Chugach.
Okay.
Because we've been down in the lower 48 talking about the issues around bighorn sheep. I want to move back up there. Right. So that was the issue. And there are a couple of reports out there talking about the intersection, the potential disease transmission between pack goats, domesticated sheep, and also llamas, right? And I just want to touch on those. So the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, that's one of them I want to talk about. And the Wild Sheep Foundation is another one I think is worth mentioning, because those are talked about frequently in the discussion around the issue up in the Chugach. So this Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, and for folks that aren't aware of this organization, it's an association made up of 19 state and it might be 3 or 4 Canadian provinces of their wildlife agencies. And they're trying to leverage all of their resources and expertise to deal with wildlife management issues all over the West. And one of the things they looked at was they look at disease. And so back in in 2000, and somebody's going to have to help me. I'm getting myself a little bit.
No, it's okay.
2012 or 14. It might even be a little after that. Anyway, the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies put together a report. Here, I've got it right here. I want to make sure I get the right one. They have a working group, and they put together a report on things to deal with around sheep. Here are a couple of the recommendations that came out of that. Some of the things that they mentioned. One, they recommended at the time, they said the use of domestic sheep or goats as pack animals by hunters, anglers, and other recreational commercial users that travel in identified wild sheep habitat should be prohibited. That's one thing they said, but that's specific to domestic sheep or goats. They don't say anything about llamas there. So I want to be clear about that.
They're talking about bovidae.
Say that again, Nephi?
Bovidae, not camelid. That's important.
Correct. I think that's important. They do talk about, where it's allowed, where pack goats or sheep are not prohibited, but are allowed, that a public education program should be implemented to inform users of risks associated. And they talk about the potential for how you might mitigation measures to minimize confrontation between those. So that's one of them. That was the recommendation. That's a specific recommendation from WAFWA to the WAFWA agencies. So that's what the organization as a whole is playing back out to the state wildlife agencies, saying, hey, this is our recommendation from us to us, basically. We're saying this is based on the information we have, this is what we should do. Then they also have recommendations on, to BLM, Forest Service, and other land management agencies. And they say land management agencies responsible for domestic sheep or goat grazing allotments, trailing routes, vegetation management, use as pack stock, or any other uses involving domestic sheep or goats should only authorize such use outside of occupied wild sheep range. Again, no mention of llamas here, right? This is so bovidae, not camelidae, right? I'm kind of mentioning these three because you're going to see a pattern, right? You're seeing a pattern from the agencies. And then WAFWA makes recommendations to conservation organizations that are working on wildlife issues around disease and sheep. And it's to assist them, assist state, provincial, or territorial wild sheep and federal land management agencies with education efforts to inform those who might enter or utilize wild sheep habitat to not use domestic sheep or goats as pack animals as they travel in and through wild sheep habitat. Again, we're talking about sheep and goats. No mention of llamas there. So that's the wildlife professionals of all the state agencies' recommendation. That's based on the best scientific information they have. That's the recommendation they're making. Can I mention quickly the Wild Sheep Foundation report?
Yeah.
As well? Okay. So the Wild Sheep Foundation has a report, and they have two recommendations, one for doll and stone sheep and another one for bighorns. And in those, they actually advocate for no use of domestic sheep, goats, llamas, alpacas, etc., as pack animals used in thin-horn sheep range for hunting, trekking, weed control, or other purposes. So they've actually, and it's very possible, I'll preface this with, it's very possible I've missed something somewhere because there's a ton of stuff to go through and read. But it would seem that this WAFWA report and the Wild Sheep Foundation report are very similar in all regards except for llamas and alpacas, these camelidaes. And I'm probably pronouncing that incorrectly.
I think it sounded great. I'll give you that.
All right, thanks.
So I think it's important to note, Dave, like you said, there's a difference and realize where that difference comes from and why it's important. So there are studies that have shown that when you put camelids and bovidae in close confinement and you tried to give a pathogen to one to see if you could transfer it to the other, there has been success. And so I'm sure that's where it's coming from. It's like, you can't say that it's not a possibility because it's a possibility.
Yeah. Can it be done? Yeah. It sounds like it can be done.
That's one of the challenges when you deal with an issue like this. From a scientific perspective, if you can create the opportunity and you can make it happen, you can never again say it's not possible. That never goes away because it's a possibility. You've showed it when you've taken 6 animals and you've successfully gone from animal A, B, C to animal D, E, F in the controlled environment where you wanted to. Am I ever going to be able to tell you that can't happen in the wild? No, because if that would be a lie.
But let me ask you this question, Nephi. With respect to pack llamas or llamas and these camelidaes in Alaska, British Columbia, is there any evidence that it actually has transmitted in the wild?
No. And that's the other piece that's important for people to realize. And so we're going from a theoretical of we think that this could happen and there's a potential to a on the ground, this happened. And as far as we know, the this happened has never been shown.
Now, that's not to say that it can't happen, because as you described, under certain circumstances,
we can't say it's impossible. We can't say we can tell you it will never happen. We just can't. because that's not scientifically true. And something to understand about science. Science is, science doesn't make judgment calls. Science doesn't make management decisions. Science doesn't care. Science is objective. Science is 1 + 1 = 2. And if you can make 1 and 1 equal 2, I'm never going to be able to tell you that can't occur again. Now, there might be some serious restrictions on where and how that occurs, and a bunch of things that have to fall in place. But that level of risk management, which is what that is, that level of hazard management and study, is something that, that's a different thing. And that's one of the things that makes these interactions so difficult, is because we're making these Forest Service folks, we're making these people who are managing these lands, we're asking them to make decisions based on the science, but they are not scientific decisions that they're getting asked to make. They're getting asked to make policy decisions that are informed by science, but those things are not the same, and they're difficult.
So I want to ask you this question. And this is an absolute hypothetical. But do you think, see, I led with do you think, it's a total hypothetical.
Yeah.
Do you think that one of the reasons that there's been that some groups have really pushed hard to have pack llama bans, or not just pack llama, but just llama bans in these national forests in Alaska and British Columbia, is they're looking to the lower 48 states here. They're looking down here and seeing what's happened over the past 120 years with the interaction with bighorn sheep and with Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, desert bighorn sheep, and saying, we have these naive populations up here that haven't been exposed to domesticated livestock the way they have down there. And it's clear they're having these challenges and they've been dealing with them for decades, and they're struggling to get ahead of it. And maybe the thing we should be doing here is, because we know there's some chance, even if it's in a minute chance, that there's this like super small chance that we could have disease transmission. Yeah. We want to do everything possible to prevent that, so we don't have to replicate what's going on down there.
Well, I think they're certainly trying to mitigate risk. I mean, that's what I think, because you don't, especially up in Alaska, you haven't seen the cataclysm that, it hasn't happened there yet. So you're looking at preventative measures, and, that kind of sheds it in a different light too. So what are you willing to tolerate? And again, it's really interesting, the world we're living in right now, right? What are you willing to tolerate in terms of risk in order to, get to a preferred outcome? And I think that's where these arguments get really challenging and nuanced, because if you're saying, well, we're willing to tolerate some risk, but not others. We're willing to tolerate the risk of animal A, but not animal B. We're willing to tolerate the risk of activity A, B, and C, but not activity D. And, again, those aren't scientific decisions. Those are policy decisions that come with a lot of challenges. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's the difference, right? Is normally we take science and we inform policy decisions. You don't always just take what the science says, because our understanding evolves over time, and you still have to fit that reality into the way people act and will react. But what Dave was describing is there's not a lot of science pushing the decision around llamas. Am I wrong? Did I misunderstand you?
Yeah. So I think you're right. What I was saying is, and what Nephi was saying is, there are no studies that suggest right now that any disease transmission has occurred in the wild between llamas and wild sheep in a confined setting.
In captivity, you've been
able to do it. So that it's a possibility, that it's something that can happen if conditions are right. And the other piece was, just because you haven't observed that it has happened doesn't mean that it hasn't, or that it won't. It just means the best available science we have right now hasn't shown that it has happened. Right? And so then the question is, really, you have this spectrum that you can work with. And on one end of the spectrum is what a lot of people would refer to as the precautionary principle, which is what I was really describing at first in the question to Nephi, which is The precautionary principle being there's a chance this could happen. We don't want it to, so we're going to shut it down completely to prevent it, take the ultimate precaution possible. And then you go through your whole spectrum of, to Nephi's point, of what kind of risk are you willing to accept? And that's kind of what level of mitigation are you willing to engage in to minimize risk, up to doing nothing at all and let it be a libertarian paradise where everything goes. Right. So, so sorry to take that from you, Mike, but
no, that's fine. I know Nephi was making this point around science is agnostic, or it doesn't take sides. It's just, it is what it is. But decision makings around policy are not just science.
No,
there's a lot of other aspects to it. And here it doesn't sound like the science definitively gives us the answer. There's policy calls being made here.
And you can use that science, and this happens all the time on both sides. I think everyone knows it, but let's acknowledge it. You can use the science to defend your decision. No matter which decision you decide you go down, there's going to be some science. You're going to be able to say, hey, look, we're going down track A because the science shows me this, or we're going to go down track B because we can measure the risks and we're okay with this risk, and so we're going down tracks B. And either way, the same science actually supports both decisions, because all it does is it says you're making an informed decision. And interestingly enough, that's what the law requires. The law requires that you make an informed decision on these things. It doesn't require that you make a decision that everybody likes.
Yeah, and in fact, that's a practical impossibility to make a decision that everybody likes.
Well, yeah. Well,
never seen that happen before.
Yeah, there's even case law that says it doesn't matter if you go against the science as long as you know it exists, right? So you can make bad decisions as long as they're well-informed decisions as a federal agency in these types of processes.
Yeah, you just explain, I've read this scientific paper and I've chosen to go a different direction.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perfectly legal. A lot of people, I think that's worth mentioning for a second, because I think the general public doesn't necessarily realize that. They think that if I hate to lump the whole public together as they, but I've seen it often enough that I think it's fair to say when NEPA is involved in particular, that if they see an outcome they don't like, they think, well, that outcome's going to cause negative harm to the environment, so that has to be illegal. That's absolutely not the case. I mean, they're going through a process where in most of these cases, if you're doing an environmental impact statement, well, not in most, but in a lot, you're going to have an effect on the human environment. And in a lot of cases, it might actually be a negative effect. And you're just saying, yep, I recognize that. I know what all those effects are going to be, and I'm choosing to do it anyway.
Eyes wide open. You're making a decision. Yep.
And you're because there's some other factor that may, there's some other thumb that's pushing on the scale someplace.
Yeah. And I think it ends up being the idea that if you go through an analysis and you go and explore what are the possibilities, you're going to find a way to come to a better decision. And so if you hadn't have done that analysis, if you hadn't thought through possibilities, you'd have gone and done whatever was most expedient as opposed to what was sound. And so it creates incentives to, ultimately do the right thing, but it doesn't require it.
There's a good lesson in the process up here in the Chugach in that you had a public, which is actually a relatively small public in the grand scheme of things, the Pack Llama Association. I don't remember the numbers, but it's something like 4,000 people. I might be totally making that up. Maybe I have no idea what it is, but it's not
two.
It's two people. It's just two guys,
it's
right?
Dave and Tom.
But the point is, it doesn't matter if it's 50,000 people or if it's two guys. There's a public process laid out. And if the agency did something improperly during that protest period,
Tom and
this
Dave
is a perfect example where Tom and Dave won, right? Yep. This is a perfect example of that, where, it doesn't matter if you have an organization that represents 2 million people weighing in saying this needs to be done this way. We need to ban llamas. The fact is, you could have 2 guys on the other side saying, you violated your process here. You didn't even let us know this was coming.
You didn't have integrity.
Yeah. So all of our discussion around whether the science says there's a problem or the science says there's not a problem is irrelevant if they didn't talk about it. If they didn't cover it and make it known that this was going to be an issue, that's enough to get a NEPA, type challenge overturned the decision.
So luckily, in the Chugach forest, if I could find a big enough llama and a small enough saddle, or I lost a lot of weight, I could ride a llama in the Chugach. Now, having said that, this thing is not put to bed yet. Why?
Well, and it hasn't been put to bed. It's fascinating. I did a little bit of research on this, and there have been a couple of examples outside of most of these issues around pack llamas have been in Alaska and Western Canada. But you have seen, there was one point in the mid-90s where the National Park Service tried to ban pack llamas in canyon lands, and through litigation that was overturned. Yep. There have been multiple efforts, like people keep taking a run at it, and with pack llamas, it just never seems to get that final traction, but people keep taking a run, and it's happening again.
Do you think llama guys feel picked on? Because it's like, both groups don't like him. It's like, if you don't have llamas, if you're a horse guy, you pick on the llama guys. And if you're a hiker that doesn't have llamas, then you pick on the llama guys. So you're just like, you're on an island.
There's just you can't win.
You don't have
Is that
any
what
friends.
You're saying?
Yeah.
There's just no way. Huh? Yeah. So you had mentioned this thing doesn't end. And I think what you're getting at is, we talked about this a couple episodes ago. And on April 9th, Secretary of Interior, through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, proposed opening up several million acres to hunting and sport fishing on 89 national wildlife refuges and fish hatcheries, lands around fish hatcheries in the country. And we talked about that and touted that as it was a good thing for sports, for the sportsman's community, more opportunity. And they have to go through a process as required by law to show that hunting is compatible with the purposes of that refuge. And they do it every year, and they put these regulations in. Well, we had one of our listeners point out to us, in fact, the very one that suggested this episode. And so, thanks for this, that buried in there was also a proposal to ban llamas and other pack animals on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And so they just finished this process in the National Forest in Alaska, and now moved north in the same state a month later, and there's this proposal made to do the exact same thing on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And I'm sure the difference between the two, and where I think, and Mike weigh in here too, I'm going to point to Mike to weigh in for the legal analysis here. But the difference here is, so in the National Forest, the process we were pointing out was there was a procedural error. And so they could protest the procedural error, and the forest supervisor in the Chugach and the forest supervisor came in and then removed that reference to llamas, right? And then you move to Anwar, and it's not, we don't have the same procedural deficiency. We have a proposed regulation with notice and comment going through a perfectly appropriate process they go through every time. So it's not like the environmental impact statement. So now to get it pulled out, it's not going to be on a procedural basis. It has to be more on you have to use the science to inform the policy at this point.
Foundational arguments. You go through the foundational arguments rather than the extracurricular argument of like, hey, you weren't fair. Now it went through the entire process the way that it was supposed to, or it is going through the process. And so now when the decision is made, you're not going to be able to challenge it the same way by saying you didn't have integrity in the process. Now the argument's going to have to be made in, factually, on the issues.
Yeah, exactly right. And it won't be through the same kind of protest process. At this point, you'll submit your comments, and I'll let everybody know right now for this, the comment period is currently open. I'm trying to see when the comment period ends. It ends June 8th. So you can submit comments on this entire proposal until June 8th. And you can make your justification and provide all the supporting material that you can. If you're going to comment on this and you have scientific information to support you, submit all of that with your comment. But then recognize that the remedy at that point, now you're in the court system. Now you're challenging a final agency action, the final rulemaking, and you're challenging a component of the rulemaking that would ban llamas on ANWR, while you still have these other 89 refuges that have opened up for hunting and fishing. And now you're letting the court system determine whether there's going to be any hunting or fishing this fall in those refuges, through limited injunctions to prevent certain parts of the rule from going into effect pending litigation. It gets a little complicated, but that's just the point here. Is the process is different for these two. No longer is it a forest planning process like we've seen in a couple of other instances. Now we're talking about a rulemaking process, which is a little different.
Yeah, and it's worthy of letting people know that there can be changes in that. So whatever the proposal looks like now, if you can make a solid argument going in, there's an opportunity for the agency to listen to your argument and to make the change in the final. And that happens frequently. And as long as the issue was talked about, when they make the change, it's valid. And the change can stick.
And actually, if it's something that you want to litigate, don't consider this legal advice, right? But if it's something you want to litigate, one of the things you need to do to have standing, or the ability to actually sue on a decision, is you need to participate in the comment period.
You have to comment.
So you need to comment now to be able to preserve standing. But then in order to have standing, once you've commented, you probably have to be able to show that you intend to use pack llamas in ANWR. And it's been something that you've done and intend to do, and continue to do, to have that standing. That's getting way too much into the, I'm providing that's not legal advice, not legal advice.
Well, I'm not an attorney, so I'll just say
factual.
If it's me, and I think that thinking someday that I might actually want to try and ride a physical camel around ANWR, that's not enough. There has to be, my imagination isn't good enough. There has to be legitimately some string attached that, for why I should be making that claim or why I should be acting for that management decision to be that way. It's not just I feel like it. There's got to be a legitimate reason for making that ask.
Now I'm going to pull out of Alaska for a second too, because we've had a lot of discussion around this issue going on up there and in ANWR. But one of the other reasons I think we wanted to talk about this is because this is emblematic of something that can happen any place else in the country. We wanted to provide you with a very specific example of a forest planning process and an issue, and how science can be used to inform decisions, and how the public can be involved in a process and can change the outcome by that involvement in a process. But no matter where you live in this country, from coast to coast and in every state, there are going to be decisions that go through a public process that you can affect the outcome of, right? And the science, the science matters, and how the science is used matters. And a lot of times how the science is used is dependent upon the voices that are brought to the table to help influence how the science is used, to help influence the policy outcome, the use of that science. And so this is a great example to highlight. This is a great example to highlight how the process can work well. I think it's a good example of how the process worked well to make sure that the agency follows its process. It's also you can then think about it on your own local level, right, of knowing how to get engaged in these planning processes. Because if you live in the Southeast, for example, a lot of national forests there, they're going to go through forest revisions and planning processes, and you want to be able to be engaged every step of the way. And frankly, these disease issues aren't going to go away either. No,
it's going to be, it's a reality of the more that you know, when your knowledge sphere increases, the more that we figure out, and the more that we see how our interactions with, the natural world affect natural things, the more we're going to have to own that, but we're going to have to own it in a pragmatic way. Because let's be honest, as a species, we can't live in a cement box, and none of us who are hunters and anglers, none of us are willing to make that trade. None of us are willing to say, like, what we'd really like? We'd not like to be a part of this natural world, period. We'd like to stay out of it. Let's let nature run its course. Let's not be involved. No, that's not an option for us. And so we're going to have to, the more we learn, the more we're going to have to take ownership of our impact and how we're having an effect on these natural things. And we're going to have to figure out mitigation. And I think that that's the challenge in these areas. And that's one of the things that, we talked about beforehand that we haven't talked about much, but on these issues, we're not taking a position on this. We are not saying that the Forest Service should do, one thing or another, that that this is the right decision and this is the wrong decision. What we are saying is we should make informed decisions. We should find good mitigation, and where we can have an effect, and it's and there are reasonable accommodations that we can make to implement best management practices in good faith to protect these resources, we should probably be doing that.
Yeah, and there are examples of it doing that all over the place. Yeah. Come back down to the lower 48 again, and hone in on the bighorn sheep population, since we've been really focusing on sheep in this episode.
Yeah.
The largest bighorn sheep population in the lower 48, I don't know if it's still the case, it used to be the case, is the Whiskey Mountain herd in northwest Wyoming outside of Du Bois, Wyoming. That herd for the past 40 years, well, not 40 years, since the early 1990s. That's not 40 years. It's like 20 years. Anyway, it's really been struggling. It had a severe outbreak of pneumonia in the early 90s, had massive declines. It's never been able to really rebound. It has other environmental factors that are impacting the population there. But the state of Wyoming has identified that as one of the most critically important herds in the state from a management perspective. And so when you talk about this spectrum of management options, in that case, they've enacted, they want to have as little contact with domestic livestock as possible with that herd. Now, other herds, they might look at and say, this isn't a core herd. And so we're going to allow more uses, and there might be some contact. We'd like to mitigate that contact if we can, but we're not going to prescriptively try and remove contact or prevent pack goats from going into these areas. So they make those concessions to risk based on the herd and the importance of that herd to the overall population and to the interests of the state and the Forest Service and everybody. Yeah. So I think it's a great example of how there even for one species there can be a spectrum of management options for one species.
I would say this:
different places,
and compromise is necessary. And here's why I say that, Dave. You know how much it costs to manage bighorn sheep in the state of Wyoming? I'm betting you do.
I'm betting you're wrong. I don't know the exact dollar amount, but did you pull up a commission report and find it?
$2.2 million a year to manage for bighorn sheep in Wyoming.
Does it pay for itself?
You know how much of it gets paid for by tags?
Probably a fraction of that.
$180,000. You know how much gets paid for if we take 5 of those tags and we then let those tags go out to the highest bidder, then assuming that that's going to come back in? It's not coming back into the agency, mind you. But assuming that's going to get spent on those animals, that's another $500,000 a year. So when you talk about the cost of managing bighorns, as much as they're charismatic megafauna, and as much as we like them. When we talk about what's paying the bills on the North American model, are they paying their own way? They are not. And so if you love sheep, and that is what you dream about every day, and you're hoping for that opportunity, don't look down your nose at other users, whether they be other animals, wherever they may be. Because remember that these other things, these other uses, a lot of times they're helping pay the bills. The reality is the general public, the taxpayer is the sport shooter. These people are helping pay for something that most of us will never get a chance to hunt.
Yeah, I can guarantee I'm never going to get to hunt a sheep.
Is that because you're never going to apply?
Oh, I apply every year.
Oh, okay.
But based on my age and the number of points required to draw, and when I started buying points, the likelihood of me drawing a sheep tag is pretty low.
Nephi just explained how you could do it.
Yeah, I don't have that kind of money.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. What we didn't touch on in this, but is also...
If somebody wants to sponsor me, by the way, if somebody wants to sponsor me for a sheep hunt, I'm all ears.
Yeah.
So I was going to say one thing that we didn't touch on in this episode, but that is honestly fascinating as well. As everybody knows, in Grand Teton National Park, we had a proposal for aerial gunning mountain goats in order to help bighorn sheep populations. And one of the things we didn't even touch on is that these natural, as much as we talk about these different disease vectors and how, this is much more complex than just looking at, hey, animal A is a pack animal, animal B, wildlife, so we're not going to let it in. Because we also have these other animals, both natural and domestic, that can be reservoirs that are out there in the environment, that are also risk factors that you have to add on top in some of these issues. For example, mountain goats, which can carry some of the bacteria, not all, because again, this is multifactorial and there's stressors and all these things, but man, it gets real complex in and how you're dealing with these things and what can give what to who.
Yeah. Years ago, Dave and I had a case. He was in private practice and I was working for the state, and that one of the, no, we were on the same side.
We're on the same side.
But it had to do with bighorn sheep, domestic sheep interaction and concerns on a forest plan. And one of the weird sort of nuggets in the administrative record was this idea that an immature ram had, a juvenile had frolicked and detoured something like 30 or 40 miles away from the original herd and was seen down in areas where there were low-level domestic sheep, not even on the forest, just off forest, and they were interacting, and then that goes off. That young ram does what rams do and brings it back to a different herd or its own
quarantine.
Herd. Yeah, right.
He goes to Daytona Beach when he's supposed to be hanging out. Brings it back to the rest of the herd. Thanks a lot, bro.
Just a whole nother factor that we could do everything and keep domestic stock away from wild animals, and wild animals can come to the domestic stock. They just can happen.
Yeah.
So
it's really interesting, and again with sheep, I love like how we treat sheep this way, but then this isn't the only disease that can travel between domestic animals and wildlife. There are others. And as we deal with, and that's what, again, I think makes this very complex. It's because we're looking at one species and we're looking at what's the appropriate best management practice here or the appropriate managerial response here to protect. Well, what about the others? What protocols are we setting? And it's there's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, I got to go back to that case Mike and I were on because you probably remember the legislature got involved in that one too.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yeah, right. I remember it too. So
specifically,
basically the legislature said if the Forest Service amends the forest plan.
Ever.
Yeah,
it was if the judge decides.
Oh, that was right. It was the judge.
This is the Larry Hicks trick. So I think he deserves credit for coming up with this
So the theory was the legislature gave direction to the Wyoming Game and Fish Department that if a federal judge decided that domestic sheep needed to be removed from the forest because of bighorn sheep, then I think it identified the forests, and then it said
it was just one forest.
You will go in and remove those. Yeah, but then the following year they expanded it basically statewide, except for their priority herds, right?
They didn't. So I don't know that they expanded it quite like that, right? They just authorize the department to do it. I mean, for that one forest, it was a directive.
Yeah. And then, but it eventually became a expansion to the same idea across the state, where they were dissatisfied with the challenge by some non-governmental organizations in front of
non-governmental organization A comes in and says, if there's this conflict issue between domestic sheep and wild sheep, we're going to sue. We're going to, we got to get the domestic herd out of there. And the legislature basically said, well, tell you what, if there's a conflict, we'll just take out all the wild sheep instead. How's that? And suddenly all the discussion about conflicts went away, and we were all willing to walk down the yellow brick road together.
Yeah, I remember having conversations with the federal attorney about how that would work.
Yes.
Because that was, while it was going on and waiting for the judge to rule, and I was like,
it was pretty entertaining.
I think the way that the Game and Fish Department responded to that, I might have the timeline wrong here, but the policy they operate under today, it might have been an outgrowth of that in part, but it was, if you see bighorn sheep that are commingling or in a place where they could commingle with domestic sheep, that they'll actually go in and lethally remove those sheep before they get back to that bigger herd.
Yep.
So you want to prevent the pathogen from coming in, but then you also, I think it's also a way of kind of walking that, to your point, Nephi, of this spectrum of management and what kind of risk do you want, and trying to find a common ground that can work. It was a way of trying to make something work where you can have domestic sheep and bighorn sheep out there and you separate them as much as possible, but not to have a deleterious effect too much on the agriculture community. And this was the way of mitigating that.
So eliminate the single frolicking ram or whatever, and as opposed to eliminating two herds.
Of course, we came up with you saw the deal from this past year. What happens when a landowner is illegally grazing sheep in an area that has bighorn sheep, and some sheep come frolicking into where that domestic herd is, that's illegally grazing, not on a legal allotment or at the right time? Turns out you kill those two.
Yeah.
That's the policy. Because really it's to protect the big herd of sheep, of wild sheep. You really don't want the disease to get back into that herd. Anyway.
So
we've kind of gone all over the place around this issue without having to settle in on taking an opinion. It's beautiful.
Because we don't need to, and we probably
don't want to. We shouldn't. We're not the experts. We haven't been involved in this for decades. We're just trying to present an issue that's been percolating in a part of the country that most people might not realize.
Yeah, and to be frank, I mean, hey, honestly, we don't live there either. And I mean, and I give a lot of respect. I will say this. I give a ton of respect to the people who are actually in that area and live with the issues and deal with them. And it's very easy for us to armchair quarterback from our basements in Cheyenne, Wyoming. It's really easy to say what people should do with a rule and a regulation in a place that's never going to affect us. It's an entirely another, it's an entirely another thing when it does. And we all need to respect that. On all these land management decisions, is that, somebody's perspective, consider consider who is saying it and why, and where they live and what they have to deal with on a daily basis before you tell them you know more than them.
Yeah, and I'll say it before, or said it before, and I'll say it again. The biggest value to this process we went through, to this discussion in my mind, because I'm with you, Nephi, I don't want to weigh into the local politics. It's the fact that people should exercise their right to weigh into their local politics and to the decision making that's going on, and understand that there's a process that the agencies are required to go through, an analysis that they have to do, and you can hold them accountable, and you should hold the agency accountable. And this was just one example that we highlighted of when somebody held the agency accountable, the agency said, yep, we messed up there. We shouldn't have done that. And they pulled it. Now, that's not to say that 5 years from now, the Forest Service says, you know what, we're going to do a plan amendment. And through a plan amendment, like some new study comes out and says, you know, llamas, there's this huge risk that we never knew about, and now we know about it, and we've got this science, and we're going to take that science and inform a decision, and we're going to put some restrictions on pack llama use in the national forest through a plan amendment. That could happen. Anything could happen. And if that happens, go through the public process and engage and provide all the relevant information you have. Right? I mean, that's what we're saying is, at least what I'm saying. I don't want to speak for Nephi or Mike, but what I'm saying is, and there's a process out there, and take advantage of it, because you don't want to second guess yourself at the end, and you don't want to miss an opportunity to impact policy when there's a process set up for you to do it.
By the way, all this reading has made me think that pack goats and llamas are actually very cool.
I will tell you, so I take big backpacking trips every summer, and invariably I pass one string of pack llamas, maybe more, on every trip I take.
Does it make you angry?
It depends on which day of the trip I'm on. If it's the first or second day, I don't care that much. When I'm packing out, and I'm like already 70 miles into it, and every step just feels like the last one, and I look up and I have 5 more miles to go. Oh, what I wouldn't do for a llama right now.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can definitively say, having hunted horseback a lot and done pack trips with horses and whatnot, I would say I would not trade A for B. Like, I would not trade the horses for the llamas. At least me. And a lot of people would. But if I didn't have the horses, the llamas are very attractive suddenly. Very attractive.
Yeah, I agree. Plus, practically they cause less resource damage than horses.
Dave, you're so practical.
They do. Well, I mean, if you're looking at just from a resource damage standpoint, there's a reason why they're growing in popularity.
Yeah, because you can't ride them. That's why, because they're too small to have a saddle.
They can't dig in. Right?
That's why they don't quite make my cut of coolest backcountry animal.
Yeah, they're still pretty cool animals. When you see them up there,
I think if I put like a hammock between a couple of them, like a travois type of thing, and just had them pull you around.
All right. Well, either way, I think we rode this one to the end.
The horse is dead. Time to get off.
Or the llama is dead? Okay. Fair enough. We're done. We did it.
All right.
Hey, if you have questions about it, reach out to us. Let us know if we missed something here. If we majorly missed the mark, we know. There's so much information out there, and Nephi pointed this out in his sphere analogy at the beginning, sphere of knowledge. Like what was fascinating to me going into this process is when you start reading it, it points you to something else to read and something else to read. And it just seems like this bottomless chasm, and you don't know where the end is. It's incredibly complicated. We just touched the surface of it. I mean, we just skimmed the surface of this issue. But it's an interesting one, and we like to touch on things in different parts of the country as well. So if you've got a local issue that's important to you that you'd like to get the word out around the country, let us know. We'll look at taking a dive into that and provide a little perspective to it. You guys have anything else you want to add?
No, I'm good.
Nope.
Nephi's just on silent. Yeah. Okay.
No, I'm like looking through these pages of notes I have, and just to say a quick no. I'll just do that rather than
all right.
No.
Perfect. Well, as always, thanks everybody for listening. The weather's getting beautiful. I'm getting out all the time. I know Mike was out rafting this weekend. I know Nephi got himself a spring turkey. I climbed a couple of mountains and did a little fishing. We're all getting out. We hope you all are too, because remember, life is about experiences. So go have one.